Ancient and Modern Britons, Chapter 5. Book by David MacRitchie. This chapter will discuss the following: head hunting on the Isles, the ancient and archaic war cries, the British war whoops, some other hints of early savagery, start of chapter. In addition to the Irish examples already given, there are many other relics of savagedom to be found throughout the United Kingdom, in the present as well as in the past. The horrible practice of disfiguring by cutting off the ears of their victims, perpetrated over and over again during the recent upheaval of the dregs of the Irish people, a practice which was also quite common in 15th century Scotland, is a slightly modified form of such barbarities as those performed on the dead bodies of the men of Herefordshire by the followers of the irregular and wild Glendower, barbarities which were lately paralleled by the Zulus in the last war, as those who found the corpses of their former comrades know too well. Shakespeare was not romancing when he made this reference. The details of this foul piece of savagery are given in the History of Thomas Walsingham, at page 557, according to Dr. Henry, who transcribes the description in his History of Great Britain, an 18th century book, and they correspond exactly with the shameful insults to our dead in Zululand. It is quite possible that the ancestors of the Zulus were, at that period, 1402, inhabiting the fatherland of those Welsh tribes, and that the kinship between the two was, at that date, by no means remote. Whether, and to what extent, any of the present natives of Wales are the descendants of those savages is quite another question. And one custom which proclaims a connection between the marsh dwellers of Scotland and those of Borneo is the custom of head-hunting, still practised in the latter country. As regards Scotland, there are, or were at the date of Martin's tour last century, tangible proofs of this. In describing one district in the Isle of Egg, he states, "About 30 yards from the church there is a sepulchral urn underground. It is a big stone hewn to the bottom about 4 feet deep, and the diameter of it is about the same breadth. I caused them to dig the ground above it, and we found a flat thin stone covering the urn. It was almost full of human bones, but no head among them, and they were fair and dry. I inquired of the natives what was become of the heads, and they could not tell, but one of them said, perhaps their head had been cut off with a two-handed sword and taken away by the enemy. Although not actually proving that the custom of head-hunting did at one time exist in that neighbourhood, the evidence of the headless frames and the suggestion of the native point to the probability of such a thing, though at a period so far back that the peasantry had almost forgotten it. But unmistakable testimony is afforded by an ancient poem to be found in the selection from the Dean of Lismore's book, translated by Dr. MacLauchlin of Edinburgh. The author of the poem is stated by the learned translator to have been the most ancient of all the Ossianic poets, and a contemporary of Cuchulainn, who flourished, according to Irish historians, in the 1st century. The poem is a dialogue between Conall and Evia, who was either the wife or the betrothed of Cuchulainn, and is chiefly made up of her questions regarding the heads of his enemies, which he was carrying upon a withe, and his answers. They were no fewer than 15, and Conall not only has the assurance to say that he killed all their owners, but further, when Eva asks him how many men he had slain altogether in vengeance for the head of Con, he replies, 10 700 men, I tell the truth. The number is. That fell by me, all, back o'er back. Fruit of my bravery and poyer. As the dialogue describes the physical characteristics of the people against whom Cuchulainn fought, it is of some ethnological value and deserving of quotation. Whose is that hairy, black, great head? With cheeks than any rose more red, that which hangs nighest thy left arm, the head whose colour has not changed. That head the king of swift steeds owned. Said Cairbar's son of vigorous lance, in vengeance for my foster son I took that head and bore it far. What head is that I see beyond, covered with smooth, soft, flowing hair, his eye like grass, his teeth like bloom, his beauty such as none is like? Weef's son who plundered every sea, I left his trunk reft of its head, I slew his people, every man. What fair-haired head is that to the east, whose hand might well have seized the heads? Well did I know his voice of old, for he and I were friends awhile. Down there it was the Cu did fall, his body cast in fairest mould. Cu, son of Con of poets king, among the last I took his head. What two heads are those farthest out, great Connell of the sweetest voice? Of thy great love hide not from me the names of them so dark in arms. 'Tis Laoga's head, and that of Cuilt, the two who fell pierced by my arms. One of them had Cuchulainn struck, hence his red blood my weapons dyes. What two heads are those to the east, great Connell of the famous deeds? Alike the colour of their hair than heroes' blood more red their cheeks. Cullin the handsome, and Cunlad brave, two who e'er triumphed in their wrath. What are those 6 hideous heads I see in front facing the north? Blue in the face, their hair so black, from which thou turn'st thy look, brave Connell. These are 6 of Cuchulainn's foes, Caledon's sons, who triumphed oft. Great Connell, father to a king, what is that head, noblest of all? How bushy the golden yellow locks, covering it with so much grace. The head of Macfin, Macross the Red, the son of Cruith, slain by my stroke. Evir, he was king, chief of them all, in Leinster of the spotted swords. Here then we have head-hunting pure and simple. It would be almost impossible to discover the nationality of the different slaughtered foemen, but they seem to have been of various races, chiefly white. The 6 hideous heads, blue in the face, their hair so black, whose owners are denominated Caledon's sons, most probably belong to the wood-stained Moors, for the blue colour could not well have been anything like the lividness of a corpse, and indeed the redness of the other faces must have also been artificial, for an obvious reason. Another relic of a barbarous era has lingered on in one or more districts of England to the present day. It is described in Notes and Caries of Ioth, September 1881, the account being contributed by one whose evidence has all the weight of local experience, and it was evoked by other similar customs, such as that known as crying the mare, described in that periodical about the same date. This curious performance is thus described. We have, or rather had until the last few years, another harvest custom, which prevailed about Mobberley, Knutsford, Altrincham, and, in fact, in the central part of Cheshire generally, and which perhaps may only be another variant of those described. This was called a shutting. When the last field of corn was cut, but not carried, the men used to come to the master and ask permission to have a shutting. Leave was, of course, granted, and then they all adjourned to some open place, on high ground if possible, so that their voices might be heard to a distance, where they formed a ring. One of them then acted as spokesman, and gave out the nominy, which means in the Cheshire dialect an oration, or the text or burden of a sermon or song. I do not remember all the words that were used, though I hope to be able to obtain them and rescue them from oblivion. It began, if I recollect rightly, "Oh yes, oh yes, oh yes," this is to give notice. One clause was that Master so-and-so has given us 40 gallons of good ale. Another was to the effect that Master so-and-so had finished cutting corn before his neighbours, and a third that he was thereby entitled to send the old mare into somebody else's standing corn. Between each period of the nominy, they all took hold of hands and, bending forward, shouted at the top of their voices a prolonged and most unearthly wow, wow, wow. The speaks of green swords, see remarks on breek and gorm. The American Indians use the term long knives to denote the men who use them, allowance of beer and sometimes a supper. Another kindred custom is the following, described in Notes and Queries of 3rd September 1881. North Devon has a curious custom at harvest time of calling the neck. When the reapers have completed the reaping of the last field of wheat, a bundle of the best wheat is selected and arranged neat and trim. The reapers then crowd round it, take off their hats, and bow to the neck, i.e. the said bundle of wheat, and then begins a long, harmonious shout, "The neck! 3 times, the men bowing and raising themselves at the same time. They then change their cry to "We you, where you means end." After this has been done 3 times, they break out into a loud, joyous laugh, flinging up their caps and capering about. One of them seizes the neck and runs to the farm with it as fast as he can, trying to get into the house unobserved. If he is successful in getting in without being seen, he may demand tribute from the dairymaid, who stands at the door with a bucket in her hand. But if she sees him while he is trying to get into the house, she holds the right to souse him with the contents of her bucket. In this connection, I shall also give some verses of a ballad included in Scott's minstrelsy of the Scottish border. He entitles it, "The Fray of Support," an ancient border-gathering song from tradition, and regarding it he says, "Of all the border ditties which have fallen into the editor's hands, this is by far the most uncouth and savage. It is usually chanted in a sort of wild recitative, except the burden, which swells into a long and varied howl not unlike to a view hollow. The words, and the very great irregularity of the stanza, if it deserves the name, sufficiently point out its intention and origin. An English woman residing in Support, near the foot of the Kershope, having been plundered in the night by a band of the Scottish moss troopers, is supposed to convoke her servants and friends for the pursuit, or hot trod, upbraiding them, at the same time, in homely phrase, for their negligence and security. The hot trod was followed by the persons who had lost goods, with bloodhounds and horns to raise the country to help. They also used to carry a burning wisp of straw at spearhead, and to raise a cry similar to the Indian war whoop. It appears from articles made by the wardens of the English marches September 12th, in 6th of Edward V, that all, on this cry being raised, were obliged to follow the fray, or chase, under pain of death. To Dr. Daniel Wilson, in his Reminiscences of Old Edinburgh, throws discredit upon the authenticity of this ballad, which, he says, was compiled by Mr. Surtees of Mainsforth, with the help of 4 widely differing versions. But, even if this were so, the existence of various verisons of such a song current on the borders is not denied by the critic, and the above version may well embody their chief characteristics. A few verses of the ballad will give an idea of its wild nature. "Weel may ye ken, last night I was right scarce o' men, but Toppet Hob o' the Mains had guestened in my house by chance. I set him to wear the fore-door with a spear, while I kept the back door with a lance. But they ha' run him through the thick o' the thigh and broke his knee-pan, and the merch o' his shin-bane has run down on his spur-leather wang. He's lame while he lives, and where to he may gang. Fie, lads, shout a my gears again. But Peeny, my good son, is out at the Hagbert head, his een glittering for anger like a fiery gleed, crying, mak sure the nooks of Marquis Muir crooks, for the wily Scot takes by nooks, hooks, and crooks. Gin we meet a together in a head the morn, we'll be merry men. Fie, lads, shout a my gears again. Doty Dan o' the Hoolet Hurst, thou was I good at a burst. Weedy we a bow, and better we a spare, the boldest marchman that e'er followed gear. Come thou here. Fie, lads, shout a my gears again. Ah, lads, we'll fang them in a net, for one hae o' the fords a little set, the Duncan and the Door-loop, the Willie Ford and the Water-slack, the Black-rack and the Trout-dub of Liddle. There stands John Forster, wi' 5 men at his back, wi' buffed coat and cap of steel. Boo, ca at them een jock. That Ford's sicker, one what while. Fie, lads, shout a my gears a tarn. Who, gar raise the reed suitor, and ring Anne's wat, wi' a broad elshin and a wicker. I wot well they'll make a Ford sicker. Say, whether they be Elliots or Armstrangs, or rough-riding Scots or rude Johnstones, or whether they be frae the Tarras or Usedale, they maun turn and fight, or try the deeps o' Liddle. Fie, lads, shout a my gears a tarn. Now can there be found anywhere on earth symptoms of more intense savagery than that displayed in these few examples of many like British customs? Whatever changes and modifications they have experienced, they are rooted in the most ferocious barbarism. No Australian corroboree was ever wilder than the harvest customs of North Devon and of Cheshire in their original form. No Comanche war-whoop that ever sickened the heart of a frontier housewife could surpass in thrilling eeriness those frightful yells that have sounded among the British Islands. It is difficult to say which of them is the most horrible, the deep boom of a buoy, the prolonged and most unearthly wow, 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 the fierce incitement of the border fury, boo, hoo, or the wild gathering cry that answered her summons, ah, 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 swelling into a long and varied howl. The English woman of support, whether she belonged to the era of buff coats and steel caps, or whether the song in its original form antedated these by centuries, had inherited the blood of as fierce and savage a people as any in history. The flaming spear and the throng of yelling warriors trampling after it are the concomitants of a most barbarous age. Other examples might be adduced to equal and to endorse those already given. There is, for instance, an illustration in a comparatively recent number of the Graphic showing a Highland dance of triumph executed at night over a slaughtered deer. That the dancers were civilized gentlemen does not make the dance itself less wild. They bear flaming torches in their hands, the pipers are playing an exciting strain, and one has only to see in fancy the dress of the 17th century mullmen instead of the modern garb evolved therefrom, and to imagine dancers of a hue as dark as a Moor's, in order to complete the likeness between this Braemar revel and the bison dancing of the American Indians. They may even have been originally identical in every detail. The dancers of the bison dance wear the animal's shaggy head upon their own, and is there not a trace of such a usage in "What shall he have that killed the deer, his leather skin and horns to wet?" Jacques says that it would do well to set the deer's horns upon his head for a branch of victory. The savage element asserts itself in many legends and myths with great distinctness. This has been dwelt upon lately by Mr. Andrew Lang, and although the precise object of his essay is rather to confute the interpretation given to this feature by the philological school, I take leave to borrow his words for the present occasion, for which they are eminently appropriate. In the study of mythology, one fact, at least, is universally accepted. As soon as a people reaches that stage of civilization in which science begins, men ask themselves the meaning of their own mythology. It is a puzzle to them. They cannot account for the strange and revolting legends of their own gods and heroes. The obvious inference is that mythologies, or rather that the crude and offensive parts of mythology, were developed at a time when people were in a different mental condition from that in which they find themselves when they begin to be perplexed by the extravagance of their own sacred legends. For modern inquirers, who are interested in mythology as part of the mental history of man, the question is, in what intellectual condition was our race when the stranger parts of mythology originated? There are many portions of mythology which seem intelligible, but there is a strange element, namely, the presence of such lewd stories as the mutilation of Uranus by Cronus, and the swallowing of his children by the same god, which is common to all mythologies. The real difficulty of the mythologist is to explain this element, the silly, savage, and senseless element, as Professor Max Miller calls it, Selected Essays, A 578. Probably none but professed mythologists know what an abundance of silly, senseless, savage, and obscene tradition exists even in the legends of Greece. To explain it away, the earliest philosophers of Greece, Xenophanes, Theogenes, and the rest, constructed various theories, now simply accusing Homer of inventing lewd tales, now imagining that these tales contained moral or philosophical allegories. The effort to explain this side of mythology still occupies students. Mr. Miura starts from the observation that most of the ancient myths are absurd and irrational, savage and senseless. Among the lowest tribes of Africa and America, he says, in speaking of the myths of Cronus, we hardly find anything more hideous and revolting. How then were these legends invented by the ancestors of a people like the Greeks, and by the ancestors of Indians, Persians, Italians, Slavs, and Germans? Was there a period of temporary insanity through which the human mind had to pass, and was it a madness identically the same in the south of India and in the north of Iceland? Now here we must desert Mr. Miller for a moment to point out, what will elsewhere be proved by abundant evidence, that the madness is identically the same, not only from the south of India to the north of Iceland, but among Bushmen at the Cape and Murray in Victoria or Queensland, among Eskimo and Kanekas. In fact, wherever human minds have produced a mythology. Indeed, as Mr. Miller elsewhere says, wherever we look in every part of the world, we find the same kind of stories, the same traditions, the same myths. Now, as Mr. Miller well observes, the difficulty is not to account for the preservation, but for the origin of loathsome and puerile legends. Here let us interpolate one remark. If we find a savage trait in the manners of a civilized people, examples of which are supposed, how do we account for these inconsistencies? Simply by the hypothesis that the now civilized people was once savage, and that it retains its savage practices when these happen to be connected with a thing so tenacious of tradition as religion. Well, if we find that a people civilized in other matters retains savage and senseless legends of its gods, why should we not suppose that these legends originated in an age of savagery and were preserved by man's inborn reverence for the past? This theory, that some myths were preserved by tradition from an age of low savagery, when men's fancies were almost incredibly puerile and hideous, is maintained throughout the article, as is also the argument that they are found all over the world, from the Eskimo to the Australians. And the concluding words are these. The future student of mythology will ask, is there any contemporary stage of thought and of society in which the wildest marvels of mythology are looked on as the ordinary facts of experience and as laws regulative of phenomena? And they will find that condition of thought surviving among contemporary and historically recorded of departed races of savages.